do some background after I read. So I'll read 22 through 24. So we're only going to read a couple verses here. Romans 11:22, NIV version. Therefore, or consider therefore, the kindness and sternness of God. Sternness towards those who fell, but kindness to you, provided that you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. And if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. After all, if you were cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature, and contrary to nature were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, how much more readily will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? Okay, here's what's going on. Romans 11, again, is about the first verse. I ask then, did God reject his people? Okay, that's what Romans 11 is about. God's people being the Jewish people, the nation of Israel, the people of God in the Old Testament, the Jewish people, the ones who received the covenants, the law, the promises, ultimately who the Messiah came through, Jesus, and in John 4, whom Jesus said, salvation is of the Jews. Okay? Last week, if you remember, we looked at the tree. That was our main focus last week, was the tree of verses 18 and down. Actually 17 and down. So this is verse 17, if some of the branches, he's using a tree as a metaphor, and he starts in 16. He says, if the root is holy, so are the branches. And the root there, he's referring to the fathers. He's referring to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, them being the roots, and the tree being the Jewish people, or the people of God. Let me see if I can find it very quickly. Okay, it's verse 28 where I gather that from. Paul says, as far as the gospel is concerned, they, meaning Jewish people, at the present time he's writing this, they are enemies on your account. But as far as election is concerned, they are loved on account of the patriarchs. Okay? There's two key words in there. One is election and patriarchs. What Paul's getting at with this verse is, okay, the Jewish people as a whole are loved by God because he elected, meaning chose by his own will and choice and decision, his own free will, God, chose Abraham. And then from Abraham he chose Isaac, right? And then from Isaac he chose Jacob instead of Ishmael, right? Isaac instead of Hagar's son. Right? And so God, through the election of the patriarchs, choosing to create a people, right? And from Jacob came the 12 tribes of Israel. And then from there, you could just see the family tree getting bigger and bigger and bigger until you have a couple million people down in Egypt under Pharaoh, right? And then the Exodus, and you can read the rest of history from there. But God chose Abraham, who was a nobody, Gentile. Okay? There was nothing in Abraham, this is so key to our understanding, there was nothing in Abraham that was special about him that God chose to make a nation out of him. He could have chose anybody on the face of the earth, and it would have been the same as choosing Abraham. Abraham was a Gentile, he was not Jewish, there were no such thing as Jewish people. So if you will, Abraham was not Jewish. But everyone who came from him, we could say, was Jewish, because God chose to make a nation out of him. In fact, that was his promise in Genesis 12. I'm going to make a nation out of you. And then we read further in the New Testament, this mystery that's revealed is that actually it's those who are of the faith of Abraham who are the children of Abraham, the true children of Abraham. And remember in Romans 9 it says, not all Israel is what? Israel. In other words, just because you're Jewish doesn't mean you're automatically within the people of God. He says later that those who are of the faith of Abraham, are the sons of Abraham, the true sons of Abraham. And so national heritage has nothing to do with your salvation. Church membership has nothing to do with your salvation. Your theological stance and doctrinal, your list of I believe this and this and this and this has nothing to do with your salvation. Okay? It doesn't. It's by faith alone, and that faith was first exhibited in Abraham. At least that's who Paul points to specifically in Romans 4. He says, consider Abraham, for he believed God, and what? It was credited to him as righteousness. Right? And so Abraham is the father of all those who believe. And that's us. And so we get grafted, this was last week, we get grafted into the tree that already exists, this Jewish tree, and by faith we enter into this tree. We are the wild olive branch, if you will, that gets grafted into the tree. I get this from verse 17 and on. So if some of the branches have been broken off, that means unbelieving Jewish people, and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in. Also, it doesn't have to specifically mean individual Jewish people. It could also picture the nation as a whole and Gentiles as a whole. Okay, obviously, not all Gentiles are saved, for surely not. I mean, think about all the people you know. And for surely not all Jewish people have been broken off. Okay, you got Gentiles believing, and today we have Jewish people believing. And there's one tree, and we're all in the same tree. We're one people of God. And that was last week. So, if some branches have been broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing sap of the olive root, he's using the metaphor of an olive tree to show the promises of God. Okay, the promises of salvation, the promises of forgiveness of sin, the promises of a kingdom that will be ruled by a king on David's throne who will rule forever. The promises in Isaiah about the lion laying with the lamb and the child sticking his hand in the viper's hole and not being harmed, and the war machines being melted down into farming utensils. Those kind of promises. We get grafted into those kind of promises, and we get to, if you will, benefit from that sap of all those promises who were to the Jewish people specifically. And we get grafted into those Jewish promises, and they become our promises. And then Paul later in this chapter, chapter 11 says, God did this, broke them off, grafted us in, then to make them jealous so that they might be saved. Again, sort of in a roundabout way, he breaks them off because of their unbelief, and then we get grafted in, and then the purpose is so that the Jewish people will see, wait a minute, all these Gentiles are benefiting from our promises. Jealousy, and then that will result in, we want to get in on this too. So do not boast, is verse 18, over those branches. If you do, consider this. You do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in. Granted. But they were broken off because of unbelief. And you stand by faith. Do not be arrogant, but be afraid. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. Okay? So here's where I want to land tonight, and this will be all new. I'm going to land in verse 21, and I want to try to go down, because we ended on 21 last night. And what's up, man? Got out early? Okay. Here's what I want to do first. Last week, I kept referring to 1 John 2, and I can't remember if I said 13 or 19. And in 1 John 2:19 is actually the reference that I was trying to get at. And so I can't remember because it's off the top of the head whether I said 13 or 19. But if you have notes from last week and you took down 1 John 2:13, it's 19. And it says this, they went out from us because they were never of us. And their going out from us showed they were never of us. And that's not an exact quote, but that's what it says. Look it up. Okay? And so I may have said 2:13, I don't know, but it is actually 2:19. Did I say 19? Okay, good. All right, so here we go. If God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. Okay, and then the last part of verse 20 says, be afraid. Okay, and this is where we landed last week, if you remember. We stopped here, and this was the end of the night. So let me pick it back up where we stopped.